taking, I know, which is a little bit, you do have a little something going on this week, and so it's a little busy, and we appreciate you. And you're joined by Joseph South, who we all love dearly, and I've worked with Joseph on so many things. And Joseph's maybe going to be able to stick around a little bit. If you have not talked to him, they've launched courses of mine, new things supporting science. You really should touch base and check into that because it's very impressive. I looked through it last night again. And excited about that. That's another commitment. I think I'm glad Richard brought that up. Not only do we want our events to have, so that you're not having to make tough choices. We know we need a partnership going forward. There's a lot of things that we're doing. Ultimately, we all want great things happening in our classrooms, and we want to support our states in supporting our districts. So we're going to be working together and having more conversations to make that happen. So, reach out to any of us, and if you have ideas for what needs to be brought together, please let us know that. So again, let's thank Richard and Joseph for being here this morning. All right, we're going to move on in our morning program. So, coming out of Indiana, there's been a lot of shift and a lot of talk about workforce and about truly preparing our students. I live down the road from a big Toyota plant where they have their foundation, and I've had a lot of conversations with people there talking about what they feel like is a cliff of workers that's heading their direction, that keeps them up at night. And the beautiful thing I had a conversation about with the people from Toyota was, this is not, manufacturing jobs are not our what we might envision of people in a dark place putting a screw in something over and over. That is absolutely nowhere near the truth. And what they're looking for, and I hear this so many ways, in so many places and conversations, is they're looking for people who have that problem-solving, creative, global kind of perspective. These are the things all of us in ed tech have been talking about for a very long time. 21st century skills, now employability skills. You add grit in there, you add flexibility in there. It's an interesting conversation. We have all known this for a while. It gets labeled different things, but it's very important. So I think it is, I'm sure, something that all of your states are talking about a lot too. There's a big focus on workforce development and those employability skills. So today we're really lucky to have someone who's going to share some insight about what does that mean and what does that mean to education. I'm going to bring someone up to introduce our very special guest. This person's a special guest to us too. And it's, I'm going to click here. You're not Richard. There you are. Dr. Michael Goldman, many of you I know Michael because he has been one of us. So he has been a SETDA member, but he is now the Executive Director and Senior Fellow at Catalyst at Penn's Graduate School of Education. In that role, he directs the bold new endeavors to design innovative education practices and to create and scale actionable solutions to pressing problems in education. You probably do that before lunch, so, just move on. So I know that's a lot, and there's so much more to say about him, but I want to get to the meat of our conversation. I'm going to bring Michael up, and he's going to introduce our guest, and then we're going to also have a time for some questions. So as you are just have your mind filled this morning, be thinking of what questions you have. So, Michael, will you come on up?
Good morning, everyone. You're not getting warmer up. Good morning. Good morning. Yay! That's a Pennsylvania welcome. So, as you know, I was the Pennsylvania Deputy Secretary of Education as one of you. I used to call everybody who was a SETDA member the MEs, the 50 MEs. And it's great to be back with the 50 MEs because I know the work that you are doing is amazing. It's grounded in practice. It's a collaborative and political context you work in, and a really complex set of stakeholders you have to involve in the work you're doing every day. So please know how much many of us who are benefiting from that work appreciate it. It's hard work. It's great to see you all again, and we look forward to collaborating and supporting your work as best we can. But I'm here really this morning to introduce our Dean, Pam Grossman, the Dean of the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. And she's amazing. Pam is an empowering leader who's driven by a passion for equity and a passion for innovation. And those are two confounding factors in a university founded by Ben Franklin. But she navigates those waters very well, and I think one of the things exciting for all of us is her practice is actually grounded in research of effective teaching practices, and especially instructional quality with a specialty in English language arts. So it doesn't get any more core to education than that. She came to us from Stanford, where she was a professor, as well as started a center for establishing excellence in teaching, and she was formerly the Boeing Professor of Education at the University of Pennsylvania, University of Washington, UW. So now three of you, three me's, have some heritage with Pam's experience. She's also chairing the Spencer Foundation and is on the board of the Carnegie Foundation. So as you can tell, her research, her scholarship, and her leadership are really all encompassed in this notion that the future of work is changing and we have to change with it. So it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Dean Pam Grossman.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to all of you for inviting me to speak today, because I understand you're the group who can make things happen across the country, so that's very exciting. In a time of fairly sharp disagreements about so many things, I think there's one thing that we might be able to agree on, and that is the rapidly accelerating pace of change. Something that in your roles, in the context of technology, you feel probably every day. So in the context of a faster future, how do we think about preparing people for the future of work? What do we think about in terms of accelerating how we think about preparing our students for the next jobs and the next context of work? So I'm going to start by actually telling a story about my own son, as an example about how the future of work is changing and how we might think about preparing students for that. So Ben, who grew up in Seattle, for the people from Washington, went on to become an Asian studies major in college. It wasn't clear to us as his parents where this would take him, but hey, we're supporters of liberal arts education, so we were very supportive. And he studied Chinese, Buddhism, and Kung Fu. So again, interesting to see where this would take him. So he, after college, looked for jobs, was the director of a summer camp, was an assistant teacher, so we saw him heading for a future in education, perhaps as a teacher. So I was thrilled about that. And then he discovered the master's program in learning, design, and technology at Stanford University. And he became enamored of design thinking. So suddenly his world changed from thinking about, and he's always been a very creative person, thinking about what you could do with kids in the context of a single classroom, to thinking about a whole new world of ideation, brainstorming, prototyping, empathy interviews. He ended up really pivoting as a result of that program and getting a job at Nordstrom, which those of you again from, well actually now everybody knows about Nordstrom, but back then it was kind of a local company, been around for a long time, and their technology department had just started an innovation lab. And Ben said, you need this design thinking stuff. It will really help the corporation. So they said, okay, you're probably right. And asked him to come up with his own job title. So he asked me, it's nice when your kids ask you for advice, what title he should ask for. And I'm like, I don't even understand what you're doing. I can't give you advice about a job title. So the only generic advice I could give you is choose the title of the next job you want, if they're giving you that freedom. So he chose the title of Chief Creativity Officer for the Innovation Lab. So think about this. He created a job that didn't exist before in a unit of this 100-year-old organization that didn't exist before. He went on to start the People Lab at Nordstrom, which hadn't existed before, and now he runs his own consulting company, consulting with companies about how to prepare for the future of work. So, you know, this has been, you always learn from your kids, and this has been, for me, a really powerful example of how do we think about preparing students for jobs that don't yet exist, that we have no idea. I mean, I couldn't have imagined what he's doing today because, again, it didn't exist. The kind of things that he's doing with companies just are being invented as we go. As you all know better, again, than most, the spread of artificial intelligence, again, means we're going to be, not only going to be inventing jobs, but we're going to be losing jobs. When Siri becomes your personal assistant, and Alexa is your personal DJ and housekeeper, I still can't get used to telling Alexa to turn off the lights. You know, it's still very odd to me. You know, again, how do we think about the jobs of the future and what will be there for the kids who are in schools today? In his book, Whiplash, which I hope you've read, and if you haven't read, I strongly recommend. I had my whole board read it. Joy Ito, the head of the MIT Media Lab, talks about, again, how to best prepare for a faster future, a future in which the pace of change is only going to accelerate. And he articulates, I think, 9 core principles that should guide us as we prepare, and they're very powerful. The principles include emergence over authority, pull over push, compass over maps, risk over safety, practice over theory, one of my favorite, diversity over ability, another one, resilience over strength, and systems over objects. Part of what he argues for in the book is giving individuals more agency and freedom to experiment, to work together to find solutions to increasingly complex problems, to prototype and iterate more quickly rather than investing in year-long strategic planning processes. He describes the need for more problem-based collaboration, in which there's a very real problem to solve, and you bring together people with very diverse experience, perspectives, and knowledge to create a solution. So this should be sounding familiar to you. And although he's not writing about education per se, although in the next edition he actually says he should have written more about education, and I agree with him, each one of these principles has implications for how we educate our students to be ready for this faster future and ready for the jobs of tomorrow. Both the kinds of jobs that might emerge in terms of the nature of the job, but also how we should be working. He argues, again, as Candace already suggested, the need for students to be flexible, problem-based thinkers, to know how to learn what they need to learn as much as knowledge itself, when they need to learn it. And what he describes sounds a lot like a form of education that's come in and out of favor over the last century, and that's project-based learning. So project-based learning is enjoying a resurgence. Those of us who are old enough have seen this pendulum swing back and forth a few times, and I, for one, am happy to see it swinging back towards project-based learning. And in Philadelphia, we're actually fortunate enough to have a whole set of schools in the innovation zone that are committed to providing project-based learning for students in urban schools. I'm really excited about it. There's the workshop school that actually prepares people for the jobs of the future in many ways in West Philadelphia. Science Leadership Academy, whose principal, Chris Lehman, is a real leader in education technology. So Philadelphia is really lucky to be, I think, at the forefront of this movement. And, you know, to me it makes sense because this current interest in project-based learning mirrors the, you know, the emergence of the maker fairs that you see all around, the idea of maker spaces, the rise of design, including design and robotics in the curriculum. And as we begin to recognize that robots are going to take over many of the jobs for which there are algorithms and routines, I think we begin to prize more some of what we at least hope are innately human qualities of curiosity, creativity, generativity, and many of the social and emotional parts of learning. By engaging students in projects of many, many kinds, PBL aspires to nurture those very qualities while also providing students to learn the content that the standards stipulate they should be learning. So it's a both and kind of situation. Technology clearly plays a huge role in project-based learning and whether or not project-based learning of the 21st century is going to succeed. But it's not as simple as, again, all of you know, as putting a device in the hands of every learner. That alone is not going to transform teaching and learning. Rather, it's enabling both teachers and students to use the technology that's appropriate to the project they're working on, to know that that technology exists, to know how to use it, and to see technology as a flexible tool for getting things done, and to invent new technologies when necessary. So I'm going to return to my son again for a minute, because he was lucky enough to spend 2 years, 4th and 5th grade, in an elementary classroom that 20 years ago was embodying all of the things that we want for students in the 21st century. Kent Daniels was a visionary teacher, very steeped in technology, and in fact, he taught technology and computers in the summer so he could afford to purchase the kind of technology that was part of this classroom. But that classroom, for 10-year-olds, 10 and 11-year-olds, looked like the Google or Apple of today. If you walked in, and in fact we did walk in, because before they put your kids in this classroom, they thought the parents should actually see what it is because it was so different than every other classroom in that school. So you walked in and you didn't see the teacher. In fact, I was looking for the teacher. I couldn't find the teacher. What you saw are little groups of students working together, some of them the computers. There were no desks in that classroom. There were workstations, sofas. Kids were clustered around. I finally found the teacher, who was the substitute teacher, who was beside herself because she had nothing to do. She told me, "What am I doing here? The kids are running everything." I said, "That's a classroom I want my son in." What we saw was, again, the use of technology. This will really date me and my son. Kids were using FileMaker Pro to file their book reports on. They were using, again, collaborative software before it basically existed. They weren't having classes on technology. They were using technology to do their coursework. And the entire curriculum was project-based. One of their favorite projects was planning a big trip to the Olympic Peninsula, where the kids did everything. Again, and the use of technology was just folded into that. So perhaps it's not a coincidence that Ben was so well prepared to jump into the workforce of the 21st century and to be reimagining the future of work. He had the kind of elementary education that perfectly prepared him for the changing workplace of the 21st century. What he got was remarkable and unique at the time. Actually, none of my other kids have had that kind of experience. And very few kids in Seattle at the time were getting it. In fact, this was the only classroom in the school that was actually doing this kind of work. So our challenge is to make this kind of learning much more ubiquitous and available to all kids in urban areas, in suburban areas, in rural areas, because this is the kind of education that's going to prepare them for the changing workplace of the 21st century. Creating teachers who can in turn create that kind of classroom environment is the kind of thing that keeps me up at night. Because again, my work is in teaching and professional development. And I think teachers want to do this kind of work. I think they're excited. When they see these kinds of classrooms, they're excited about it. The question is, how do you support them in enacting the kinds of practices that support collaboration, that support autonomy, that support self-regulated learning in the context of project-based learning. My own analysis of why we keep going on this pendulum is that we invest deeply in project-based curriculum. There are great curriculum out there. And the Lucas Education Foundation has been investing more and more in developing really high-quality project-based curriculum. What we never invest in is teacher learning. How do you actually help teachers understand and develop the practices that, again, support project-based learning so that they can succeed? And how do we prepare leaders who, again, can support the teachers in doing this kind of work? Because this kind of teaching is harder, not easier, than teacher-centered instruction. It's much harder. So one of the questions, again, when I look back and I look at my son's experience, I think the best thing the principal did actually was to get out of Kent's way. Things seem to be working. That's not how we're going to spread that innovation, right? Very few teachers had the opportunity to learn from Kent and to spread that. So we have to be thinking about, how do we spread this? How do we support, again, teachers and leaders in developing the knowledge they will need? And that includes knowledge of how to use technology in very different ways in their classrooms. So today, Penn GSE is making a very big bet on student-centered learning and project-based approaches to teaching and learning. We're in the midst of redesigning our teacher education programs so that we really are focusing on, we did some research on what are the core practices that again, I wish somebody had done this for my son's teacher, but we've gone out to the teachers who are most successful at this kind of work and tried to identify, what are they doing? What is it that they know how to do? What are their mindsets? And then building those practices into our pre-service program. We've also launched a nationwide professional development program for teachers around project-based learning that, again, focuses not on designing the curriculum, but on the practices that support the enactment of that curriculum. So again, all of this has incredible implications for technology and how we think about the technology that kids will be interacting at. And we're, again, really lucky at Penn GSE because we have faculty who are at the forefront of both creating those technologies and supporting teachers in learning how to use them. So Susan Yoon, one of our faculty members, very involved in this team, is somebody who has been teaching teachers how to use the app developer so kids can develop their own apps in the context of the classroom. Yasmin Kafai developed the e-textile curriculum to encourage more girls to get into coding and computer science, and that curriculum is actually being spread out across the country this year. Now she's moved on to the I know all about makerspaces, but she's created the BioMaker Lab, which is this affordable, transportable kind of environment where kids can actually experiment with DNA so that they're making new kinds of things. She assures me it's safe. And I'm hoping so, because it's spreading out into classrooms. So again, it gives kids a chance to learn biology by actually making things and experimenting in, we hope, a very safe environment. Making this kind of transformation is also going to take research. Research requires us to test not only what works, which has been a big emphasis for research in the past, but what works for whom, under what conditions, in what contexts. As we think about personalized learning, we need a research base that will help us understand, again, what works for whom, under what context. And again, we're very lucky at Penn GSE because we have Ryan Baker, who's a leader in learning analytics, who is really thinking about how do we learn from the big data that education is now producing to get smarter about, particularly in the context of online learning, what makes people succeed? What trips them up? How do we build more intelligent systems within that to support different kinds of learners? I think the vision for personalized learning is a lot like precision medicine, but medicine is way out ahead of us in terms of the research of what matters. So we need to invest in that same kind of research so we can get smarter, faster about what supports individual kids. So as I hope you can tell, I'm really proud to lead a school of education that is really investing in this future, that is really thinking hard about what it means to prepare students, teachers, and leaders for this faster future. And as we think about the future of work, really reimagine what the skills are and how we prepare them. We're really lucky to have Michael leading Catalyst, which again is a hub for innovation at the heart of the school that Ben Franklin founded. So again, I love it when you can create those kinds of skunk works right at the heart of really old institutions. Universities don't have a reputation for moving quickly. I can't imagine why. But places like Catalyst are going to help us be more nimble, more flexible, more easily able to connect with the teachers, the leaders, the policymakers who are going to help us imagine the future of education and of work. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Pam. I'm going to put a shameless plug under Pam's leadership. The Penn GSE is now the #2 ranked university, U.S. News and World Report ranked graduate school of education. And now you can see why. It's pretty obvious. One of the things that's great about universities, and you talked about this notion of research and how we're working hard to get research in the hands of practitioners. Universities are great at creating research and knowledge, but not so great at disseminating it and operationalizing it. So how might we share with 50 me's the work that we're doing, the knowledge that we're gaining, and make it easy and accessible to them and their school districts?
And this is one of our challenges, is again, how do we make sure that there's two-way communication between people who are doing the work, so that we can learn from them, where we can figure out where the pain points are, where researchable issues might be, and people can learn from the work that we're doing as well. And again, I don't think this has necessarily been universities' strengths. So we're really, and that is part of the mission of Catalyst, is to rethink what that two-way communication looks like. How do we, again, create new kinds of forum and opportunities for people to learn together, where it really is two-way, because we have a lot to learn for what's happening in the field, and we think that we're producing things that might have implications as well, so that there's constantly that conversation. And I think we're inventing some new models for doing this. So one of my favorite is something that Michael is running through Catalyst, which are these short cycle inquiries of getting school leaders to identify a common pressing problem of practice. I love that Michael keeps talking about the mini-me's, the 50 me's, the sense of you have a lot in common. So school leaders share a lot in common, but they're always trying to solve problems individually. So how do you better bring people together to work on common problems, to collaborate, again, let's go back to Joy Ito, to think about the emergence, to think about pulling in that diverse expertise and bringing people together to solve those problems. So we brought in a whole group of school leaders who identified changing the nature of instruction in math as the common problem. And this is a big problem. I mean, it's one that I recognize from my own work. So how would they change the nature of teachers' questions? They identified something fairly narrow, and then they all worked on implementing some solutions and then committed to sharing. So they were doing inquiry in their own schools. So it's a form of improvement science. So if you've been following the changes in improvement science, this is a notion of that, of the plan, do, revise, kind of iterate model. So they were doing that in their own context, but then coming together to share that knowledge, to get smarter together. So I think that, and we do have expertise in math education that we could bring to that table. They had expertise in their own context and what was happening there. So those are some of the examples, I think, of things that we're trying to imagine. Where we have the Consortium for Policy Research in Education run by John Sapovitz. He's trying to imagine very different conversations with policymakers, with people who actually can be part of making things happen. Where again, we think about what are the things that they're grappling with and how do we synthesize things to bring that back to them.
Any questions? Okay, shout.
So, what do you think is going to happen then to student teaching? My wife's a teacher, and she has a lot of complaints about what student teachers are doing. They don't seem to be prepared, and obviously, maybe only isolated to our little state. But you know, what do you see happening for project-based learning and student teaching?
That's one of the reasons we're changing our whole teacher ed program and hoping to work with other schools of education to reimagine what they're doing. I mean, one of the things that we heard from our partner schools, we were placing students in project-based schools. And so we did this project together with some of the leaders for that school, and they told us, you know, you're not really doing the kinds of things that are preparing this for them. So how do we change to make sure that we're preparing the kind of teachers that those schools want to hire? And they do hire our grads, but then they say then often they have to unlearn and relearn. So how do we get rid of that piece of it and make sure that when they enter those schools, they've already had those experiences? So part of what we're doing is we have partner schools across Philadelphia we'll be working with. We'll be placing student teachers in clusters in those schools because they need to see what this looks like when it's well done. And really then teaching courses that focus on some of these practices. Some of them will be co-taught with the teachers in those schools. So you're right, we've got to start. We started actually at GSC with the professional development program, but it's much easier to actually start at the beginning and get people to think about this is what teaching looks like than it is to change people's long embedded notions of teaching.
So, got a question over here, and maybe a follow up to Tim's question. So he asked about the supply side. I'm going to ask about the demand side.
Yeah.
How do you dialogue with boards of education or state leadership or more at the district level, even with superintendents, when they're thinking about hiring and they're looking for those kind of criteria and thinking about project-based learning, mastery-based learning? How do you sell them on that when they're stressed out about making certain numbers with high-stakes assessments, et cetera?
So so I said one thing that is we have to invest in order to help project-based learning and any other form of student-centered active learning succeed is the teacher development piece of this. The other side of it is the assessment side of it. So one of the things, you know, there's a lot of interest right now in social emotional learning, in 21st century learning. I think it's captured people's attention. The levels of stress students these days, I think, have again captured people's attention, and they're realizing we have to do things differently. But the assessment piece is going to be a pain point. If we continue to use traditional assessments while we're trying to teach towards different kind of outcomes, we're going to run into that same. Now, we're lucky at Penn. We have Angela Duckworth, who runs the Character Lab, and she's committed to developing new kinds of assessments that have to do with more of these things, and I think we're going to have to invest in those. But I do think right now, again, I don't always use project-based learning. I sometimes say student-centered active learning because there's many different forms of it. And again, more and more the pendulum is shifting towards that of realizing we're going to have to make students more the agents of their own learning. And so I think you can capture people's attention. Then what you have to do is to be able to connect the dots. How will this make you look successful? How can you make sure that your students are succeeding? But you heard, this is that the employers are demanding, right? So again, if we can prepare them so that they're ready for jobs, they'll also get that feedback as well.
Hi. My question is more about how does your school prepare all teachers, and that includes general education teachers, for working with students with disabilities or varying needs. And so a lot of our gen ed teachers come in and they are not prepared for an inclusive classroom. And they expect the special educator to do all of it, but they need the skill set themselves to be able to make it a truly inclusive classroom, because one special ed teacher can't help all the students in the classroom. So how is your program supporting that idea of universal design for learning where everybody understands how to meet all kids' needs?
Thank you for that question. That's one of my very first experiences at the University of Washington as an assistant professor, was actually working on an inclusive teacher education program. So I co-taught with a special ed professor and learned so much for her, and all of those students were actually co-certified in general education and special education. So this is something I think about a lot. I think we do have to prepare teachers differently to really be prepared in two levels. One, they need that knowledge about the individual differences and how to support and design for individual differences. The other thing is they have to know how to collaborate. They have to know how better to work with the other resources in their school. One of the fabulous schools that I've seen recently is PS 172 in Brooklyn, New York, in which the special ed and the general ed teachers were working so well together, you actually didn't know who was who. They were really working to support every student. Again, every student was included in those classrooms, and the students with IEPs were doing just as well as the kids in general ed. That's the model. And then thinking about, again, how do we back end that into our teaching programs? We are actually learning from, we have multiple teacher ed programs, and one of them, there's a very experiential special ed component that pairs students with special needs students on Saturdays. That's been very powerful in changing the mindsets of those teachers. And so we're now actually thinking about what would it be like to build that across all of our programs. So again, learning from what's working and then being able to scale that.
So I'll take the last question. There are 50 me's here. What advice would you give them in collaborating with universities or as they take this work for the future of work on their own?
I think working with universities to think through what is the transformation that has to happen, both in leader preparation, teacher preparation, while we have lots of alternatives. Right now, most people are still prepared within traditional institutions of higher ed, and I hope and think that institutions of higher ed know they have to change, that they can't keep doing business as usual. We've got all kinds of signs on the higher ed front that if people are paying attention to. So it's a particular moment, I think, to really work with those leaders to think through, particularly, maybe deans are one part of it, but it's actually the next level down, the people who are running the programs, for how can you think differently about preparing the teachers and leaders for the kinds of technology that's coming. This is something that I think we've struggled with. I'm hoping that with the new generation that is very familiar, that's coming into teacher education, familiar with technology, it's a slightly different kind of proposition than it was 20 years ago. But we'll still need to change what we're doing to help people, again, prepare for the 21st century. So I think, again, these partnerships, the collaborations of really bringing people together to say, this isn't a one-off solution. We're not going to succeed for all students if we keep just doing it individually. We're really going to have to build consortium, collaboratives, partnering together across, again, going back to Joy Ito's diversity over ability, across diverse stakeholders to get the solutions we're going to need. Thank you all for your time.